Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Welcome to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very, very, very special guest, Rupert Darwall. Rupert, welcome to the podcast.
My pleasure.
Rupert, how would you describe yourself?
A maverick, I think.
A maverick, yeah, but you were in the city, weren't you? At one
I was
point?
in the city. Actually, to give you a bit of background, I went to the other place, other university, James,
Right.
the one that tends to rank higher than the one you went to.
The one that people go to. Yeah, I believe you mean Cambridge, where people go if they can't get into Oxford. Yes, carry on.
Yeah, and the one that tends to score higher, James. And after that, I spent 2 years in the Conservative Research Department at the noon of Thatcherism in the mid-1980s, between the 83 and 87 elections.
So you actually worked under Margaret Thatcher to a
I
degree.
worked, yes, and Norman Tebbit. And indeed, the first party chairman I was there with was John Gummer, no less.
The less said about him, the better. Although we might have to move on to that painful subject later on. So you were in the Conservative Party in the glory days.
Yes.
When it actually when the government was not
Yes.
run by complete incompetence.
Yes. And it wasn't just Margaret Thatcher. It was every 6 months or so, Geoffrey Howe would come out with a heavyweight speech because obviously he wanted to succeed her. And these were speeches, politicians made speeches that you wanted to read because you'd learned something from them. A great deal of thought went into what they had to say, unlike today where it's just a prepackaged.
You mean they had a philosophy underpinning the words that they were speaking? They weren't just sort of virtue signalling or.
It wasn't about virtue. See, they were also wrestling with real-time problems, and the government wasn't at all popular. So they had to say why we're doing the right thing. What are the signs that we're doing the right? How the economy is coming right, and so forth. Where do we want to take the country? They had to think all these things through for themselves. Then they wanted to communicate it.
We're going to talk about that later on, maybe, because I want to talk to you about the reason you're here, and the reason I came across you, which was that you and I share an interest in the climate industrial complex, the whole green nonsense. You've written two excellent books on the subject, the latest of which is called Green Tyranny: Exposing the Totalitarian Roots of the Climate Industrial Complex. I like this. The only thing that's missing from this book, and I think you know what from the cover, and I think you know what I'm going to say, it really needs a swastika on the cover, because after all, the key chapter is the one at the beginning, which describes the origins of the modern green movement. Tell us more.
Yeah, the chapter's called Europe's First Greens, and it's about the period between the wars, when the Nazi period in Germany, and they really were Europe's first Greens in so many ways. It's not just the case that the NSDAP was the first political party anywhere in the world to have a wind power programme. That is a historical fact. It's all kinds of things. There's a chilling line in there where Hitler says to a political aide, I'm not interested in politics, I want to change people's lifestyles. So when people talk about health fascism, there is a profound chilling truth to that. They wanted to change people's lives in the most fundamental sense. There's another thing he said, I don't need to nationalise industry, I can nationalise people. And that's what they did. And that's, again, in a way, what's happening now. And there's the parallels, if you like, or the resonances with modernity, with our contemporary world, I think are so worrying that chapter, as you say, James, is a very important one.
It's quite. Just before we turned on the tape recorder, you said to me that so far columnists and reviewers have shied away from mentioning the Nazi chapter, perhaps because they think it's just a kind of trolling exercise. Because after all, if you wanted to write a book about the modern green movement and why it was wrong, and you wanted to really goad the Guardianistas and the New York Times, then you would include a chapter saying about how green Hitler was. But you're not making this stuff up, are you? It's all there.
It's all there. It's all on the record. It happens to be a fact that 6 weeks after invading the Soviet Union, Hitler told his dinner companions that wind is the future. Wind is the future. There'll be a bit of cold, but it's wind and tide and so forth. But there's a relevance to this. This is not just sort of digging up the past for the sake of it. It explains what's happened in Germany. It is Germany that greened Europe. Why did Germany go green? So I look into the rise of the Greens in the 1970s, the New Left, the Frankfurt School in the 60s and 70s, how that took over the Nazi ecological warriors from the Nazi period, the old Nazis, neo-Nazis and so forth. And so there's a link between the Nazi period and the rise of the Greens in Germany, and that is absolutely profoundly important to an understanding of modern Germany and modern European politics.
Why were the Nazis, why was Hitler so keen on wind power and tidal power? And did he like solar as well, or was that...
They didn't have the technology for solar, but it's interesting. Again, I have a chapter in there called Sun Worship. I mean, why does Germany have the most solar PV capacity of any country in the world? It's not because Germany's sunny. There is something in... The explanation lies in German culture, in German philosophy. And going back to the Nazis, it happens to be the case the swastika is an Indian sun symbol, for example. There's that opening line in Also sprach Zarathustra by Nietzsche, where Zarathustra comes out of his cave and he says, "O great star." So there's something in German culture. And there is this, in a way, there's this schizophrenia or the bipolarity of Germany, which is that its success is built on industrialization, on being the most successful industrial nation, arguably in the world. And at the same time, there's a profound spiritual, philosophical, aesthetic hatred of industrialization and what that means. So they want to go back from the factory to the forest. And if you like, it's this unresolved and unresolvable dilemma that Germany has that has been exported to the rest of Europe, including ourselves.
One of the interesting points you make, a distinction you make, which I think is often made not often enough. I mean, I think those of us on the red-pilled right, let us say, I think we have a pretty good idea of the similarities between the communists and the Nazis. There's really not a cigarette paper's difference. But one of the differences you pinpoint is that the Nazis were kind of nature worshippers. They were almost anti-industrial progress, whereas the communists were very much believers in theory.
Correct. Yes. I think there's also an irrationality in Nazism that there wasn't in classical Marxism. And going back to what we said about how the Nazi period joins up with the New Left, the Frankfurt School, the Frankfurt School had to accept, like sort of post-19th century Marxists had to accept, that the proletariat wasn't in the vanguard of the revolution wasn't going to happen, and so they bought into the corruption of the working class by consumerism, by industrialization, by capitalism, and they then morphed into this irrationality that you also get with the Nazis. So if you like, the Frankfurt School is a synthesis between classical Marxism and Freud. So Thanatos and whatever. I mean, it's a lot of garbage. But what they tried to, by using Freudianism, they can hope to explain the failure of classical Marxism to do what it said it would do, and in doing so, they kind of end up in the same place as the irrational, traditional German romantics, if you like.
So, obviously, Hitler was channeling people like Haeckel, the founding father of ecology. He was also a German, who in turn was channeling the Romantics. Do you think the Romantics were the first? Gave birth to all this kind of wishy-washy, flowery, back to nature?
I wouldn't call it wishy-washy. I think I think we had a sort of wishy-washy stuff, if you like, in England with the
daffodils.
There's some, the Lakeland poet. I wouldn't call the Lakeland poets wishy-washy, but there is a sort of love of nature that you get in English culture and Ruskin and sort of the rural stuff. But the German stuff, Germans being Germans, are deadly serious, and that's the big difference. And they couldn't resolve the industrialization of their society with the sort of mysticism and the idealism of the back to nature stuff. And this gives rise to this profound, as I say, bipolarity in German culture.
And of course, it's very relevant today, given that we're about to see possibly the fall of Angela Merkel, who has been brought down not by her disastrous immigration policy, but ultimately by Energiewende, hasn't she? This
Yes.
greenification of Germany.
Yes, and I think Angela Merkel has a big part in this book. I'm intensely critical of her. I think she has been a dreadful leader of Germany. I think by and large that since the war, Germany has been blessed with a succession of very impressive political leaders, from Konrad Adenauer right through to Gerhard Schroeder, and then you think of people like Helmut Schmidt. Helmut Schmidt was the best Western leader of the 1970s. Whilst the US and the UK were going through a period of funk, Helmut Schmidt kept Germany straight, level. He saw through a dreadful period of domestic terrorism from the far left, from the Frankfurt School. He saw those people off. The SPD was a very good government.
So were Baader-Meinhof, were they Frankfurt School?
They were Frankfurt School.
I didn't know
that. They
were
Frankfurt School. And not only so when we say Frankfurt School, they were Frankfurt School in Frankfurt. So these terrorists and Joschka Fischer and Danny Cohn-Bendit, they were all mates. They were all 1968ers. And I tell the story in there that how after one particularly savage terrorist incident, I think there might have been the street riots or something like that, Joschka Fischer said, violence no more. And this is a guy, remember there are photos of him in Tunisia at a press conference with some Palestinian terrorists. They really went on the dark side, and Joschka Fischer pulled himself away from the violence, Danny Cohn-Bendit as well. But they all knew these terrorists. These people who ended up as terrorists.
Isn't one of the reasons that the Green movement is so dangerous that a lot of people who read kind of mainstream newspapers, who read the Mail or the Times or the Telegraph, think that Greens are that they're in it because they care about nature and that they're harmless, and that organisations like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth and so on, and green leaders like Caroline Lucas or the ones in Germany are basically motivated by a love of nature, and that they care that little bit more than most of us.
Yes, I think that is their biggest single. That's where their power comes from. That people assume their motives are pure. And they don't look at the ideology behind it. The chapter the heading I've got there is Power Without Responsibility. You remember what Stanley Baldwin said of the press barons: power without responsibility, the prerogative of the harlot throughout the ages. And those are the NGOs now. The NGOs have power without responsibility. They are not accountable for the policies they push. We see that with dieselisation. We see that with things like the palm oil policies. We see that with cutting down forests to burn in Drax and so forth. This is power without responsibility, and they are the shock troops, if you like, of the climate industrial complex.
It's funny. I had to do a piece for a newspaper this week, and on this topic vaguely, and the commissioning editor at this paper just would not allow me to get away with saying all the things that are true, that I know and you know to be true about the whole climate change scam and about the bad faith of the people involved in it stuff, because he thought it sounded too much like a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, I think conspiracy isn't quite I wouldn't describe it as a conspiracy for two reasons. First of all, in terms of the narrative in Green Tyranny. We've talked a lot about Germany and the rise of environmentalism and renewable energy and the ideology of renewable energy. The other leg to the story is Sweden, of social democratic Sweden. And it happens to be the case that Sweden was the first country to talk about acid rain in the late 1960s, and then in the early 70s they started going on about global warming. Olof Palme, the Swedish Prime Minister, was the first world leader of note to talk about global warming. 1974 interview. That's when Al Gore was still at law school. Why were they doing? Why were the Swedes obsessed? Why are the Swedish Social Democrats obsessed with global warming and acid rain? Well, of course, they weren't genuinely obsessed with it. It was a political tool. They wanted to have a vast nuclear power program, so they started a war on coal to persuade Swedes that if you don't have nukes, you're going to have coal. And so they started off, but we didn't end up with nuclear power. We ended up with wind and solar renewables and so forth. So if you like, the hinge of the story, Sweden having started this whole thing off, the hinge are the Greens in Germany. But in terms of the climate industrial complex, Joschka Fischer, one of his early books on the politics of the environment, talked about he wanted to create a green entrepreneur class, people who'd make money out of it. So that the idea of creating a new rent-seeking green class was there right from the beginning.
Right, yes. That canny move by Joschka Fischer. But you brought in Sweden earlier than I'd like, because there's so much to talk about the German element first. But may I say that your Swedish chapters were an eye-opener to me. I'd sort of bought into this line that I think it's become a commonplace, hasn't it? That Sweden was the kind of the golden mean of Western civilization, not too extreme, and everyone was blonde-haired and happy, and the welfare system's great, and their economy's booming. None of that is actually true, is it? I don't think.
Sweden is not what it appears. It is it's in a way, it's more like Italy than you care to think. And I was very surprised writing this as I interviewed people who, there was a very senior, there's the top legal advisor from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and what he told me was eye-opening. To give you an example, we all know that Sweden has been neutral since the Napoleonic Wars. That's part of the Sweden's thing. It hasn't fought a war and neutrality and so forth. And what actually happened, the truth is very different, that after the Second World War, the then Swedish Prime Minister thought, well, we can't face up. We've got the Soviet Union just at the other end of the Baltic. We're going to have a secret defence alliance with Washington. So throughout the years of the Cold War, there was a secret pact with Washington. And Washington supplied aeroplanes, or it supplied the kit to make so that Sweden had one of the most modern air forces in Europe. There were radar stations so that could look out to the east of the Baltic to see what the Soviets were doing and so forth. So they were like kind of militarily integrated with
I always
NATO.
wondered why the Swedes had such good fighter aircraft, the Saab, Viggen and Draken.
And they built, for example, they had this policy of turning their motorways into temporary runways. So the Swedish Air Force would use those, and the regular airfields were lengthened to accommodate US cargo supplies.
Right. But also, I said we weren't going to talk about Sweden in this section, now we seem to have got stuck on it, but there was something sort of almost Brave New World about the way that the Swedes organised their society. The way that, for example, school children were taught to think in an aggressively communitarian way. They weren't taught about individualism or...
There's a thing that Palmer said when he Minister of Education and Propaganda. He was in charge of state broadcasting as well as his role as Minister of Education. And he said, we don't teach children to be individuals, but to be part of a group. And there's a Swedish education bureaucrat who talks about the freedom to give up freedom. And you mentioned like Brave New World. That is absolutely right, because there's a book written by the Observer Scandinavian correspondent Roland Huntford in 1971 called The New Totalitarians. So even then there was this sense that social democratic social engineering was producing a society unlike any other.
Is there any coincidence? Is it pure coincidence with the fact that the countries in Europe now where you would least like to live because of what's happened with Islamic immigration and terrorism and stuff are probably, well, okay, France runs it pretty close, but Sweden and Germany have both been particularly screwed. I was wondering whether there's any kind of ideological or intellectual connection that enabled them both to go for the green lunacy and go for this immigration.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. I mean, what is the case at the end of the first Swedish chapter, that Sweden was the Swedish Social Democrats were, a lot of German Jews were fleeing, obviously, Nazi Germany. And it was the Swedish Foreign Ministry who said to the Reich Foreign Ministry, that German Jews had to have a J stamped in their passport so they could be stopped at the border. And then Sweden closed its borders to German Jews. So there is a sort of Sweden and Germany, there is something.
There's something rum. There's something very rum about them.
Yeah.
Can we just rewind a second? I can't get enough about the Frankfurt School because I think so much of what's wrong with the modern world is traceable to their weird and dangerous Alinskyite plan to ruin everything. Just tell me a bit more about, because I remember as a child growing up with Baader-Meinhof and stuff and hearing that people had been assassinated or blown up or whatever, and now it's all in the past, a bit like the IRA is in the past for so many for the new generation. What happened in that era?
What happened? Well, first of all, the Frankfurt School was founded is a bunch of German Jewish Marxist intellectuals in the late 20s, and they founded this school called the Institute for Social Research. It was funded by successful businesses. I mean, this is the story of capitalism financing people who want to bring it down.
Yep.
And then when the Nazis came to power, they first of all went to Switzerland, and then they went to New York, where they pitched up at Columbia, and then they spent some time in the U.S. university system, where they heavily polluted it. I mean, they had had a major negative impact on the American academic life. I mean, people like Marcuse, obviously, but their thinking has infected American university life. So I think a lot of the awful things that you see in US universities, actually, you could trace back to the Frankfurt School. And then in the 1950s, one of the big American foundations, I think it was the Ford Foundation, financed their return to Frankfurt. So the Frankfurt School went back to Frankfurt. And it happens to be the case that West German students and high school students were the most left-wing in any country. So there was an opinion poll in, I think, 1969. 30% of West German students said they supported communism or Marxism.
Why would they say? Because of the Frankfurt School, or they just happened to be that way?
I think partly because of the Frankfurt School, but then you have to ask yourself, why were West German youth so ready to receive this pernicious garbage? That's not a question I can fully answer. It might be to do with them reacting to their parents being party to the Third Reich.
Yes.
As Paul Berman, who I quote extensively in the book, says, that the New Left came into being as a reaction against Nazism. They were looking for Nazis under every bed, in every cupboard, and so forth. And so they're a reaction to, and their argument was that late stage capitalism is fascistic, is on a path to a fascist state.
Right. Even though actually they share many of the tendencies of the Nazis.
Correct. And as Paul Berman puts it very succinctly, that having set out as the anti-Nazis, they ended up Nazi-like. And where I extend his analysis is by saying, well, that is exactly the case with their adoption of environmentalism. They essentially took on the Nazis' environmental policies, whether consciously or not. They ended up in the same place. And if you mix red and brown, if you mix red and green together, you get brown. And so there's a kind of
interesting one. Yeah, I like that. Just so we don't lose the thread altogether, just take me through from to the Baader-Meinhof.
What happened in the late 1960s, you had student riots and so forth. I mean, in Oxford, as you know, the student riots were very mild. There was I
don't remember it, but
there was a little sort of demonstration outside All Souls, and the master or whatever of All Souls was called John Sparrow, and they had placards saying Sparrow is a tit, whereas in Germany it was a lot more serious. And there was one, and it was all bound up with the anti-Vietnam and so forth. And there was one demonstration in West Berlin in 1967 when a protester was shot dead. And according to the New York Times, 40 years later, it said, this is the shot that put Germany on to being the progressive nation it is today. And what's very interesting is that shot fired by that West German policeman, was a Stasi agent.
That's right. That's another interesting fact in your book, which I should have known, actually, that the entire German peace movement, and by extension the Green movement, was funded by the Russians, Soviet Union.
You had the Green Party. The Greens were formed in 1980, and very quickly, and the Greens were formed in response to spontaneous protests against civil nuclear power, because Helmut Schmidt, in response to the oil crisis, Germany's got to have nuclear power stations, and there arose a spontaneous reaction against nuclear power. More spontaneous, if you like, or more vitriolic than anywhere else.
Atomkraft Nein Danke.
Exactly. And there are 2 or 3 pages in the book trying to... I asked Benny Peiser, now at the GWPF, who incidentally was one of the founding Greens. He is ex-New Left. He really he knows this stuff, and he thinks it's to do with there's Heidegger and the technophobia of the Nazis that we've already talked about. But there's also, he thinks there's war guilt, that Germany did these terrible things. Why didn't the Americans drop an atom bomb on Berlin rather than Hiroshima, kind of thing? So that's all bound. There's sort of something. So the New Left, Danny Cohn-Bendit and Joschka Fischer, were exiled, effectively living in internal exile after the terrorist atrocities. They were washed up. They had nowhere to go. They saw these anti-nuke protests. They saw that was their way back. Then very quickly after that, you had NATO's decision to put in cruise and Pershing missiles in response to Soviet SS-20s. And very, very quickly, if you like, the Greens morphed into a much larger peace movement. And you're absolutely right. It was financed by the Soviets. The local communist parties were deeply involved in it. They knew everything that was happening. They controlled it. And it was, if you like, the climactic point of the Cold War. And I don't think many people realise that. The Soviet Union put a huge amount of effort into destabilising Western public opinion against Cruise and Pershing, because they knew if they had their SS-20s and NATO didn't have medium-range missiles in Western Europe, the Cold War would be over, that the Atlantic Alliance would be over, and Western Europe would become neutralised, like Finland actually was neutral. So the 1980s in many ways was the most crucial decade of the Cold War, and these guys worse than sock puppets, glove puppets, acting on behalf of the Kremlin.
And Petra Kelly, who was the leader of the German Greens?
Yeah, for a time she was, and her boyfriend. Don't forget her boyfriend.
This is great. I love this.
General Bastian, who was Generals for Peace, no less. Generals for Peace. And they went over to East Berlin, to the Alexanderplatz, I think it was, and they got arrested. And when the police found out who they were quickly released. And the next day they had a letter from Herr Honecker saying it had all been a terrible mistake and how interested he was in the Greens and the peace movement. Of course he was, because as we now know, Bastian was a Stasi agent, and it ended in tragedy actually, because his last day the Greens were, as the Stasi files after the Berlin Wall came down and the Stasi files were opened up, people started probing about him, and he'd received a phone call from the Greens saying, can we have your permission to look at these, to open up these files? And he shot Petra Kelly, and then he shot himself. But he was a genuine Stasi agent.
And if you put that in fiction, people would say it was silly. And it actually happened. Yeah.
And people to this day, there are people on the Greens, the Progressives, still don't believe it. They won't believe it.
Look, the reason I find this whole story fascinating, all this Groundhog Day that I experience every day writing about this crazy stuff, is because I can never quite believe that such stuff is being practiced in a rational world where there ought to be hard-headed journalists reporting on this stuff and exposing it. And they're not. I mean, people like you and me and Christopher Booker and David Rose and all our oppos in America and Australia, there aren't many of us doing this. I mean, this should be across every newspaper every day.
Well, that's right. That's absolutely right.
But we'll talk about that in the next section. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my incredibly special guest, Rupert Darwall, author of the must-read book of the moment, Green Tyranny, Exposing the Totalitarian Roots of the Climate Industrial Complex.
Sonny Johnson brings her cutting-edge conservative commentary to SiriusXM Patriot every week on Sonny's Corner.
So there's one simple rule that I follow. You should always protect and defend ideas and principles, not people. People will let you down. Your ideas and your principles will keep you steady through any storms.
Sonny's Corner, every Saturday at noon East on Breitbart News Saturday. SiriusXM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Rupert Darwall, author of Green Tyranny. Now, Rupert, in your amazing book, and it really is, it's a quite an eye-opener. You talk about the scare that preceded the global warming scare, and actually which gripped one country more than even more extremely than climate change has. I mean, the Germans were obsessed with it, weren't they? Acid rain,
which was going to kill their forests, and there was a
Waldsterben or something.
Yeah, a forest death.
Yeah.
So acid rain was the industrialisation. What comes out of power station smokestacks was killing off the spiritual homeland of the Germans, which is their forests.
The forests, yeah, exactly. Where Arminius defeated the Romans. Yeah. I can see. Yeah, it's like the unleash hell.
That's right. And the thing is, you're right to call it a scare, because the whole thing it came out of Sweden at the late 1960s. The Swedes called for that first UN environmental conference, Stockholm, 1972, and they called for it because they wanted to put acid rain on the agenda. Why were they obsessed with acid rain? Well, it goes back to what we were talking earlier. They had a huge nuclear power program, and that's what's the way to attack coal-fired power stations? It's acid rain.
So I would imagine that people who remember acid rain will be saying to themselves now, well, there's no smoke without fire. You couldn't just invent something like that, a scientific problem which terrified half the world. You couldn't just make that up, but you could, couldn't you?
Well, acid rain was the prototype of global warming. So you get the same characters involved in it. The person who wrote the first government report on acid rain was Bert Berlin, who became the first chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You read that acid rain report, it's like reading a report on global warming. Just change the words acid rain to global, and it's the same. The national academies, like the Royal Society, the Swedish ones, the National Academy of Sciences in the US, they all were saying this is proven scientific. They were more sure about the science of acid rain than they were of global warming. So that's on record.
Just tell me the theory of acid rain.
That the combustion of coal at high temperatures produces nitrous oxides and sulfur oxides. These go into the atmosphere, and there are chemical processes that turn them into acid that make precipitation more acidic. Now, there is some truth in this, in that it does they do make rain. These emissions do make rain more acidic. It also happens to be the case that rain is naturally acidic. It also happens to be the case that acid rain is fertilizer. So if you look at grass, a field after a thunderstorm, have you noticed it looks greener? And that is because the lightning makes the rain more acidic, and it improves the fertility of the soil.
So far from being the forest killer, acid rain is actually benefiting forests.
It benefits plant growth. It's very similar to carbon dioxide. As we know, carbon dioxide benefits plant growth. Anyhow, the idea was that because of various chemical processes, they were damaging trees and they were turning the lakes acidic, and it meant there were no fish. And the poster child of this was the lakes in the Adirondacks in upstate New York. And if you recall, at the beginning of the 20th century, when Teddy Roosevelt was out fishing, he was on a fishing holiday, McKinley was assassinated. He was on a fishing holiday. There were clearly fish in that lake. There aren't any more fish. And they're saying, well, the acidity is destroyed, the pollution, blah, blah. In fact, the science of that turned out to be completely wrong. And that's why it's really important. This episode is incredibly important because it shows why scientific consensus cannot be relied upon, cannot and should not be relied upon as some kind of guide to policy.
Isn't this one of the hardest things to explain to people? I've recently been having a run-in with Michael Gove over his proposed ban on neonicotinoids. And his line to me has been, well, I've got this paper written by a scientist which says that neonicotinoids are harmful. And I say to Gove, well, listen, you've got to question your sources. You can't just go, a scientist has written this, therefore it's true. Because there is plenty of historical recent precedent for scientists just making stuff up for whatever reason. And I think most people, the average man or woman in the street, if you said to them that scientists are writing papers which are just full of bullshit, they would look at you and say, no, I think there's something wrong with you. I think you're the wrong one with your arts degree, because I trust these scientists. How does one convey to these people that what's going on? I
think you look at the example of acid rain, because the national academies, the scientists all said acid rain, the pollution from power stations is causing acid rain, and this acid rain is destroying forests and ecosystems and so forth. And it turned out that science was wrong. And the real scandal in this, James, is that the Americans put in a 10-year national acidic precipitation assessment program, NAPAP, and it reported it started in 1980, reported in 1990. And that study began to show that actually the science was wrong. And unfortunately, the first George Bush was elected as the environment president. He gave the Canadians undertaking he would act on acid rain. They pushed the cap and trade. Remember cap and trade, the Clean Air Act amendments, and through Congress, and they suppressed that report that showed that the science was junk until the key deals had been made in Congress. They suppressed it. Then they blackened the name of the scientist, the key scientist, Edward Krug, who demonstrated it was junk. And to give you the reason why we talked about the Adirondacks in upstate New York, what had happened there, the lakes had become acidic because what had actually happened was in the late 19th century, the lumber trade had come in, they cut down a lot of trees, they burnt the stumps, and that had reduced the acidity of what were naturally acidic lakes. When conservationists came in and said, you can't do that, you've got to let the forests grow back and you can't, burn stumps and so forth, the soil changed back to what it was before, and so the lakes became acidic. But what was scandalous about this was that the Environmental Protection Agency in the US suppressed the report. They then blackened the name of the dissident scientist who exposed the science for what it was. And still to this day, the EPA maintains, many people tell you with a straight face that power station emissions cause acid rain, which kills off lakes and forests.
That's something that one ought to perhaps discuss with Scott Pruitt or somebody with influence at the EPA. Incidentally, just in parenthesis, isn't one of the many great achievements of Donald Trump that he has finally trashed the legacy of the Bushes as well as the Clintons. I mean, I don't think anyone now looks at the Bushes and thinks of them as in any way conservatives, as in any way even halfway competent as presidents. And if nothing else, that's an achievement.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the environmental record of the first Bush on acid rain was actually scandalous, and it was his EPA. Who knows what the first Bush knew about the science of acid rain. I would give the first Bush credit, though, for seeing the peaceful conclusion of the Cold War and the reunification of Germany. I mean, I think that was a very impressive accomplishment.
Okay, but going back to I don't want to.
I know you don't want to say that.
No. It's just that if there's one thing I hate more than a socialist, it's somebody wearing the clothes of conservatism and betraying the cause. I just think that I expect conservatives to behave better than the left. I expect them to observe things like empiricism. This is why I'm so cross with Gove at the moment, by the way. I mean, I'm sorry it's a running theme here, but it seems to me that what you're describing, that what the first George Bush did, where he put green virtue signalling above the scientific truth. He had the evidence in front of him that acid rain was bunk. He not only ignored this stuff, he actively suppressed it and trashed the reputation of a scientist who was producing credible evidence that it was bunk, because he saw more votes in paying obeisance to the Green Fairy.
I think the contrast is also with the Reagan White House. The Reagan White House performance on acid rain was very impressive. They didn't have the benefit of this Edward Krug's analysis. In fact, when you look at they set up a review panel because the Canadians insisted on having joint working parties on the science of acid rain and so forth and what to do with it. And the Reagan White House, instead of having the National Academy of Sciences doing the peer review of this stuff, they set up their own panel. And that panel was very impressive. They did a really, really good job. And then you look at the papers that panel was fed, there wasn't a single one that questioned the science, even though Krug had just produced a paper. They weren't, and I talked to one of the people on that panel, and they weren't given. Instead of which, they were given lots of papers produced by Germans, which of course were, hysteria about acid rain.
Yeah. You lost me there.
I should say the scientist who from that area is Fred Singer, who is the co-dedicatee of this book, is an absolute hero. I mean, he is what a scientist should be. I mean, he is such an impressive man, and his reputation has been attacked by people like Naomi Oreskes and that dreadful book. But he is the model of what a scientist should be, and what he did on that acid rain panel was really deeply impressive.
They have taken so much shit, that generation of scientists. Fred Singer, Will Happer,
yes.
Even Freeman Dyson has been discredited. Even what's his name? Gaia Theory. I'm getting Alzheimer's. I interviewed him last week.
Oh yeah, week. He'll come back.
How can I forget his name? That's terrible. Having a senior moment. But yeah, all the generation of they tend to have retired, don't they? Because they're the only ones who can wear this
yes.
hatred.
I think it's also they have a view about what science is about.
Jim Lovelock.
Yeah.
It took me so long. Yeah, carry on.
They have a view of what science is about, which is a very sort of classical scientific revolution view as applied to public policy. And it was tremendous what they did. And I think it must be awful for them to see how science has, people call it postmodern science.
Post-normal science.
Or I call it pre-modern, because it's actually a reversion to what science was before the scientific revolution.
It's interesting. I did an arts degree, as you know, and I had assumed, not unreasonably, I think, that postmodernism was a phenomenon that had confined itself to the arts. I mean, sure, it had screwed up classical music and given us all that atonal nonsense, and sure, it had given us Joyce and the sort of the weirder stuff that came after us, and that's fine. Same with movies. But when it comes to science, you would have thought that scientists would stick to like facts and stuff and observations and experiments and empiricism. You would never imagine that other rules could start entering science whereby politics could become more important than observation.
Yes, and the other thing that they don't do is test alternative hypotheses, which is just so fundamental. It's just what they do is say, well, we know what we're looking for, and then they assemble evidence to back. Well, they don't actually look at the counterfactual.
Yes. It is so depressing. And again, I think the theme of this discussion, really, the underlying theme, is how is this amazing, you don't want to call it a conspiracy, but whatever it is, this amazing scandal, why is it not more widely understood? And it's because it's so big. It's a bit like Hitler's big lie theory. If you tell a lie big enough, no one will believe it's a lie, because how could you do that?
It also becomes part of the furniture that governments have invested a huge amount of political capital. They've invested a huge amount of our capital in it, and they can't admit that it's all been a terrible mistake. Yeah. Then you've got the people who make money out of the climate industrial complex, who profiting from it. And you've got, I mean, one of the things that surprised me in researching the book is the extent of the billionaire green foundations in the United States. The old ones like Rockefeller, MacArthur, Ford. The new ones like the West Coast billionaires that are financed.
The Silicon Valley people.
The Silicon Valley oligarchs. Well, hundreds of millions of pounds has gone into lobbying, and they create these sock puppet organisations that the amount of money that has gone into this is absolute, and it's not going to roll over and die, and it's turned into something much bigger than any other environmental scare before. I mean, if one looks at sort of ozone, or we talked about acid rain, that was nothing compared to this. It didn't have this these vast interest groups and these foundations back it in the same way.
Do you have a theory on why it is that these foundations established by people who've made lots of money out of capitalism turn violently against capitalism? What's the rationale behind that?
In a way, I would perhaps suggest that the most important chapter in this book is chapter 5, which is about intellectuals. And there's one of the greatest economists of the 20th century was Joseph Schumpeter, who incidentally said he had 3 ambitions in life. He wanted to be the greatest horseman in Vienna, the greatest lover in Austria, I might have got those 2 mixed up, and the greatest economist in the world. And he said he got 2 out of the 3. Keynes, I think, pipped him, obviously, for the third one. But Schumpeter, in Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, he argues that Marx was right for the wrong reasons, that capitalism would turn into socialism not because capitalism would fail economically, but because of its very success. Within it, it contains the sociological seeds of its downfall that capitalism itself would bring out. And it would, unlike any other civilization or society, it pays the people, it pays intellectuals to criticize it and to bring it down. And what I argue in the book is that environmentalism is the key to capitalism, key to the Schumpeterian downfall of capitalism. And that in some way, that if you look at the leaders of industry and fund managers of the elite of capitalism, and if you like, you can look at the Aspen Institute as a proxy for that, they bought into environmental catastrophism in the 1960s. So the people who should have been defending capitalism, Schumpeter calls the modern corporation the fortress of capitalism. They opened the gates. They let the Frankfurt School in. They let the environmentalists in. They put them on the boards. They gave them money. They said, Paul Polman of Unilever, we share your agenda. So it's like capitalism is failing from the inside.
Can I ask you, because unlike me, you've worked in the city. You're probably friends, or at least acquainted with a lot of these people. I mean, there was a guy called with me at Oxford called Richard Norse, who now runs some sort of green fund.
Yeah.
And what I want to know is, do these people know what they're doing is wrong and scientifically unfounded, or I mean, is it from a position of ignorance they're doing it, or just do they sort of pretend it's not happening? La la la. This money's been made, and so that's what we do. We make money.
The way I put it in the book is that global warming is ethics for the wealthy, in that if you're there saving the world, saving the planet, you can make a lot of money from it, and it's justified. You're doing, to use that thing that someone said about Goldman Sachs after the crash, doing God's work. You're doing God's work, saving the planet from these. So it justifies your accumulation of a great deal of wealth, and that's why I'd also argue why Silicon Valley is in the tank for this stuff, because here are these multi-billionaires. They made more money than Croesus. How do they defend themselves from being the 0.1% right at the top of the pile? Well, they cloak themselves in green virtue. Now, whether they think it's a crock of shit or they believe it, to me, is irrelevant. There's a clear business case for being green, which is this is the way you make money and this is the way you keep your money.
Yeah, I know what you mean about not caring, but I'm interested just because, for me, if you know the truth about something, there's only one way to behave, and that's to go with the truth. But it seems to me that my observations of the world, as I've got older and wiser, are that most people don't think that way.
Well, it's much easier to believe in the truth that makes you money, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, it's that Upton Sinclair quote, isn't it? Yeah. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Rupert Darwall, author of Green Tyranny.
Hey folks, I want to tell you about Breitbart News' Second Amendment newsletter, Downrange with A.W.R. Hawkins. Features the top gun stories of the week, every week, and guest columnists like Gun Owners of America's Larry Pratt or Armed American Radio's Mark Walters. Also features a review of a firearm or firearm accessory each week. The newsletter downloads on Thursday, comes right to your email inbox. You can subscribe at Breitbart.com/AWR.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very, very, I would say uber special guest. I would actually go that far. Uber special guest, Rupert Darwall, author of Green Tyranny, which shows basically that the Greens are Nazis. I mean, at heart, they're spiritually they're not.
Red and green makes brown.
Spiritually, they were at Nuremberg, John. You know that quote? I think it's John. Maybe it's John Betchman. Spiritually, I was eaten. I think he said. Anyway, right over your head. Probably got the quote wrong. How disappointed are you with the Theresa May Conservative government?
I think anyone who isn't disappointed is probably not being entirely honest with themselves, that it hasn't turned out as many would have liked. I mean, I know actually your instinct was this was heading for disaster.
I read a bit when she got the job. I said my Cocker Spaniel would make a better Prime Minister than Theresa May. So I was right, but
many of us were wrong, I think. And
why did you like her? Why did you think she was going to be okay?
Because she'd run the Home Office, which is an incredibly difficult department, quite successfully. I mean, she kept the job, she kept the lid on, which I think really is the best you can do in such a difficult department. And secondly, that she was not David Cameron and George Osborne, that she was there kind of
big selling point
on sufferance from them, and she seemed to have a serious attitude towards politics, and it wasn't about the next day's headline politics, as she kept saying, isn't a game. And I thought that was very good. I was also very heartened when she became Prime Minister and the cabinet she put in. I knew from the word go that Hammond, I thought that was a huge mistake on her part to appoint Philip Hammond as Chancellor.
Let's not forget Rudd as well. That was an awful choice, wasn't it? Amber Rudd.
Do you know, Amber Rudd, she gave one speech as Energy and Climate Change Secretary, which was by far the best speech of any of those, going back to Alistair Darling, who was the last sane energy minister, where she talked about renewables should pay the cost of the intermittency they inflict on the. It was actually really good. So I give James. Perhaps I'm being charitable, but I give her a pass. But I think the thing that what she said on the steps of Downing Street about everything that they do in government would be geared to sort of making life better for people who was for people who are struggling. I thought that was great.
I'm with you.
Absolutely great.
That, after all, was what Margaret Thatcher did, what Reagan did, what Trump is promising.
And John Howard in Australia won election after election doing that.
So all the really great leaders that we admire do this. They help the working man and woman get on with the business of improving their lot.
Yes, and they're not fawning to the metropolitan press. It's about that gave me. I thought this is really good, and I think on our special subject, which is climate energy policies, you put
the first thing she did. The first thing she did was to abolish the Department of Energy,
and she announced a review. She announced that review into Hinkley Point.
Yeah,
which looked great. Which looked great.
The white elephant that is Hinkley Point.
Yes,
producing energy at what? How many times more the going rate?
It's over double the wholesale price.
Yeah.
And completely unaffordable. It necessarily means higher energy.
And she also had an advisor in that beardy bloke, Nick Timothy, who in his days as a Conservative columnist had decried the Climate Change Act as a complete disaster. So we thought, we've got some. Yeah, I understand your enthusiasm.
And I think then if you look at leave to one side the election and where we are today, and this a government that seems to have no backbone, no sense of direction. But there is a clear, if you have the test of what's good for ordinary families, you would look at energy policies. You would look at these insane decarbonisation targets. You would look at the Renewables Energy Directive, particularly as we're leaving the European Union, particularly as we don't have to be bound by this energy insanity that bubbled up from Germany, which we've talked about. What are they doing? James, what are they doing?
Tell me. Upset me. Go on.
Nothing.
Yeah, I know. There was. I don't know whether you saw.
Well, we know what they're doing is they're doing energy price caps, which is so their policies are driving costs up, and they're trying. It's awful.
Certainly, there was in the papers today. There was a report by British Gas, I think, which said that £200 a year on our energy bills is now green tariffs. And what was the response of BIS, the business department? It said, we don't believe this figure. We've got our own figures which show it's only 90 quid. So in other words, they're in denial about these massive additions to our energy bills.
Well, the thing is that in the Conservative manifesto, the June 2017 manifesto, it's set out the aim of Britain having the lowest energy costs in Europe. And they said we'd commission a review into the cost of energy, which has been carried out very ably by Dieter Helm, one of Britain's leading energy economists, which basically says current policy is a disaster. It is unsustainable. That the democratic consent to higher energy costs is going to go because it's and what's the government doing?
I'll tell you what it's doing. Michael Gove is tweeting that he's seen David Attenborough's Blue Planet. He saw the baby whale, and he's so upset that the government's going to take action on plastic bags. even though we know that 95% of the plastic pollution in the oceans comes from nowhere near the Western world. It comes from about 5 rivers, all of which are in Asia, Africa, etc., the real polluters. So this is what here is possibly the soundest minister in the government, the guy who you'd think would be the stand-up guy for conservatism, and he's thinking, how can I best virtue signal? Nobody in this government is doing anything to address the problems.
Well, I think what's the tragedy is that as we leave the European Union, one hopes that there will be a Brexit dividend, and the obvious one is because Eurosceptics have gone on for decades about the common agricultural policy, and we know that, as free traders say, if we could import food from around the world, food prices would be low. We also know from New Zealand experience from the 1980s that when they cut farm subsidies to virtually zero, the farm sector went through a difficult transition, and now farming ended up as a higher proportion of the New Zealand economy as a result, because it got more efficient, more market aware. It started producing, New Zealand wines took off as a result of that. And there was a big deal that Michael Gove could have done, which was to the farming sector, we'll cut your subsidies are going, but at the same time we're going to cut the environmental regulations, all the insane amount of land management, the way the farmers are imposed on by DEFRA and the Environment Agency and so forth. That would be the deal. And they would have, and ordinary people, going back to Theresa May's speech on the steps of Downing Street, ordinary folk would be better off.
Why do you think that people like you and me sound increasingly like such swivel-eyed freaks? People who believe in sound.
I have this awful sense that each generation has to live through socialism, and you and I are old enough and young enough to we kind of the last people to last generation to have experienced. I mean, my memories of the lights going out from the miners' strike, and it's somehow kind of seared into me
your folk memory. And
going back to what we talked about at the beginning, I was in the Consider Research Department when you saw a very impressive government, a group of ministers pulling Britain around, how difficult it was, how they were taking a step into the dark. No one had done this before. No one had retreated from socialism and said, actually, capitalism, we're going to go in a capitalist, we believe in markets. We can't demonstrate to you it'll work, but our belief, our analysis, and that took tremendous courage.
Yes.
So I think that's what makes, and so I have this terrible feeling that we are going to have to experience socialism again. And this won't be socialism like Tony Blair. We can slag off Blair and Brown, but really, if you're going to have a Labour government, you have a Blair and Brown government, because they wanted to keep the show on the road. These guys, Corbyn and McDonnell, want to show that capitalism doesn't work. They want the wheels to come off.
It'll be socialism red in tooth and claw, and the damage they do will be...
it will be horrible. It will be really horrible.
There will be one small scrap of consolation, which is that the snowflakes who voted for this shit will suffer. I mean, they will, won't they? Surely, please God, let them suffer.
I think that the British young people are not collectivists like Corbyn is. Corbyn is a relic from the Bennite 70s. They're not libertarian because they're not libertarian. They are snowflakes. But on the other hand, they are hedonists. They're out for themselves. They have smartphones in their pockets. They go on, they're on EasyJet, every other weekend or whatever. You look at Britain's town centres. These guys are not hair shirt socialists, and they are not going to like it.
They're not going to like it. No, they're not. Because I think they're not going to be able to get... I went to this amazing restaurant the other day in London that summed up where the kids are at, where the kind of the beardy generation, the hipster set, the millennials are at, and it was this restaurant which wasn't a restaurant, and it was in one of those work life units. What are they called? Live work units, and it was like a canteen where they charged you to eat there, and the food was very, very good. It was really well done, but it was a restaurant that you couldn't actually get into except by sort of buzzing yourself in and almost as if you worked there, and obviously you didn't work there. So it was sort of semi-communitarian, part capitalist. They served craft beers, and I just thought there's something charming about this, and at the same time kind of suicidal, because these projects are only possible ultimately in an affluent society. The only reason you can source these ingredients and you've got the leisure time to do this stuff is because you are buoyed by a system where there's money floating around. But when the day comes when capital flight and all manner of horrors, then you're going to question your ability to do all this stuff.
I think the impact on London in particular of a Corbyn government. I mean, people complain that London's overcrowded, that property's too expensive, that commuter trains are too full. Jeremy Corbyn will solve those problems.
Can I say I'm quite excited about that? I think it's about... I speak as an ex-Londoner. I think it's about time Babylon took a hit. I really do. And in the same way, I was at this dinner the other night. A friend of mine organised this dinner, mostly for James Delingpole fans, but there were a few people there who were kind of, I think, came along for the ride or something. And we were talking about wither the Tory party. And some people said, straight face, that they thought that a good potential leader would be that Scottish lesbian soldier woman. What's her name? The leader of the
Ruth Davidson.
Yeah, Ruth Davidson. And I said, you know what, guys? I would rather Jeremy Corbyn was the next leader of Britain than Ruth Davidson. I said, she's perfectly affable. I like lesbians as a nothing against that, nothing against Scots. But the fact is that her squishy politics are precisely what is wrong with the Conservative Party. That they've watered themselves down so much in order to try and accommodate themselves to this world where they think that conservatism isn't possible anymore, that we may as well have a Labour government.
Yeah, she's also... The Conservatives' problems are not north of the border. They're in the heartlands, which are in the southeast and the home counties and so forth. And the idea that Ruth Davidson's got a special connection with them is just sort of absurd.
Yeah. Yeah, no. But do you see where I'm coming from? That I remember saying this like 15 years ago. I remember being interviewed by Ian Dale in the days when they were in Doughty Street and they had that kind of experimental TV channel. And I was saying, I'd rather we had a dose of socialistic government than this ongoing watering down of conservatism by successive ghastly squishes, like from David Cameron to... I mean, everyone since Margaret Thatcher, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't wish hard socialism on anyone.
But you said it's necessary, because
but it might be something that is inevitable rather than... And it would be a bit like when Francois Mitterrand won in 1981, the Fifth Republic hadn't had a socialist, a left-of-centre government. And they were hard, they were hard left. They were hard left, that government. And the French bourgeoisie was terrified by it, and the French economy went through a very nasty 2 or 3 years. Corbyn will be a lot worse. There's much more. London has much more foreign money in it, and there's too much debt. There's excessive leverage in the. That would just come crashing down, and it would be brutal. It really brutal.
What do you think the model for what we should do is? I'm thinking, what was that? That hilltop fortress in Israel, Masada. I think that would be the only option for people like us, wouldn't it? We just retire to the fortress and all kill ourselves, rather than surrender to the Romans.
Is that
That's what happened in Masada?
Yes.
All the Jews, the Jews fled to the I consider myself a Jew in this scenario.
Yes.
Although I quite like the Romans too, actually.
Yes.
But I mean, what? There's just no hope. This gels with what another podcast guest, Roger Scruton, said.
Yes.
He said, the only thing, I'm afraid, that is going to make people realise what is worth fighting for, what is worth preserving, and what is worth jettisoning, is another war. Corbyn would be like our Passchendaele, but lasting longer than a few weeks.
Yes, but I think the big problem is not the British people. I think it is the leadership. I think it's the political cadre. And as you say, this squishy conservatism, which is basically socialism light, or now Corbyn light, is politically disastrous. It is preparing the way for Jeremy Corbyn. It's licensing Corbynism, and it's politically absolutely insane. Politics is dialectic, or it's binary. It's yes or no, left or right, taxes up, taxes down, kind of thing. That's how the policy detail may be, but in terms of what you project, you have to give the electorate at each election a real choice, and it's between heaven or hell. And
we know what heaven looks like.
We know
he has 3 initials, JRM. It would be the best thing ever, wouldn't it, Jacob Rees-Mogg?
I think you'd be in heaven, James.
I would. Would you not?
I think
it would be the best thing in the world ever.
Isn't it a travesty he's not in the government?
That's exactly why he's not in the government, because he shows them for the bunch of squishes that they are. And
he has got something very rare in politics, that he's got a very impressive temperament in the way he handles questioning. When he questioned his questioning of Mark Carney of the Bank of England, incredibly impressive. He's got intellect and temperament, which is a very, very winning combination.
He doesn't do what I do, and what I think most of us do when under pressure or in difficult arguments. I get excitable. I start thinking about what sort of naughty tactics I might use. He just looks the questioner in the eye, or looks his critic in the eye, and uses facts and his deep knowledge and logic to engage and destroy.
And good manners.
Oh, I think on that, I think we should just leave our dear beloved listener, who is our friend, our very special friend, just like feeling really comfortable and happy, just bathing in a bath of ass's milk, but heated up, just blood temperature, maybe a bit warmer, and that is the bath of Jacob Rees-Mogg, and all these candles around, and just is great. Thank you very much to my special guest, Rupert Darwall, author of Green Tyranny. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole. Thank you and goodbye.